Hello and most welcome to 715, and I will today talk about Ludwig Wittgenstein and the limits of language. Ludwig Wittgenstein meant that language is the same as life world, that language and what you do cannot be separated, and that every language to be known demands that you actually understand the life world of the language users. Describe the aroma of coffee. Why can't it be done? Do we lack the words, or for what are words lacking? But how do we get the idea that such a description must after all be possible? Have you ever felt the lack of such a description? Have you tried to describe the aroma and not succeeded? This is a quote from Philosophical Investigations. Often readers of Wittgenstein thinks he is too esoteric or hermetic to be of use. But Wittgenstein has a way of going about things that really speaks to you in a manner most direct. His style of teaching, because that is what it is, it's a teaching, doesn't use complicated words or abstract thinking. It goes to the core of what it is to be living. And I really like one of his saying, the human body is the best picture of the human soul. In the Philosophical Investigation, Wittgenstein introduces a term, to follow a rule. To follow a rule is something really into the world. And it means you play the game, you are inside something. And it's all a matter of progress. You can get better or you can get worse, but you never remain the same, ever. Language is what he calls a life form. So it depends on your abilities, on your daily stamina, or the toners for today. Those are factors that generally never are the same. One comparison could be to follow a rule is to follow a law. Because every law that's made by the government or somebody else needs to be tested. We don't know how the law works before it goes into practice. And practice for some laws can take several years. And as you all know, laws often, very often have unexpected effects. We usually, in ordinary language and in scholarly thinking, have another method or a more static method of understanding language. You could call it a take. And that's language is solidifying. It becomes unmovable. And in this becoming unmovable, it starts to seem that language refers to something. So first you have this live language, you have a sort of, you can call it a wave, it becomes more and more stable, and in the end it becomes unmovable. And when it becomes unmovable, it's starting to mirror something. A sort of illusion starts to come, but it's actually a created thing, at least to some extent. So that you could call that a very, very crude rule, a not very helpful rule. So one could say that this solidifying process ends with that there becomes a world. And this becoming a world, a referent for the language, is almost, could be called an oversimplified rule, or just the general feeling you don't have complete command over language anymore. In general, the whole language, the whole nice world becomes stagnated, static. So this statifying process is actually when starting to come up an idea, it's referring to something, an outer world. So this outer world is just a sort of symptom. Things are not to the best effect. Whereas language is a living thing, because our life world is a living thing. It cannot be static. It cannot correctly, so to speak, always refer to the same thing. You see, having two worlds, one world of the language and one world of reference or things in the world, is a sort of monosemic way of thinking of language and world. Because obviously, if you only have one referent, or two or three, but more or less definable and perceivable as being out there, or at least that is what you think, that's actually the classical physical worldview, and it is mainly monosemic because of that, although it's not a theory of language at all, of course not, but it is strikingly similar in this aspect. It's taking a referent. Another example could be that, how can we describe this? For instance, words like dog and cat, they've been mainly consistent over the years. But if you try to define love or heavy or even Russia, it would be very hard to do that in a complete and precise way. You can't define them, but still we use these words with confidence every day. And this is something that is stated from Peirce, one of the interpreters of Wittgenstein. The fixed rails on which we are supposed to be running on when we use a descriptive word are a fantasy. So describing something is not the main purpose of language. Let me give you an example here. The French equivalents for here and there are ici and là, respectively. But if I point to a pen and I said, le stylo est ici, that would be the French equivalent of the pen is here. But you say instead, le stylo est là. Because in French, là is always used to refer to a specific place or a position, while in English, here and there can both work. This rule is so obscure, most people never learn it. But obviously, every born French speaker does the same thing correctly. So we can't even say what it is in the end. We could try, but we could never succeed. And these are obvious hints to that language and life world are one and the same thing. And in the end, you will run into trouble if you want to translate something from English to French. And you might program a computer to translate. I pointed to Paris on the map and said, she is here. This is a nightmare. And these examples occur frequently. Those are very interesting because on a graded scale, for instance, Swedish people have a tendency to think that's the same world we're all living in. And although these seem very down to earth and natural to say such a thing, as always, the naturalness and the lack of problems here are just when we don't think about it more deeply. It's when we start to think about it more deeply that we run into trouble. We realize when we really put our head to it, that this is very problematic. Otherwise, it won't be a problem for us. We can just say that, but it doesn't withstand proper thinking. It can never do that. Can never come an explanation for what this extra word would be, where it would be, and how it would work with reference. How reference would work is a gigantic problem. In philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein goes very deep into these kinds of practices and all the ways in which they can possibly work. In everyday life, in mathematics, and especially when it comes to referring to our thoughts, sensations and feelings, whatever they might be. Especially in his later works, Wittgenstein is using some sort of affluent, almost sophistry-like writing. And it often comes in gnomic fragments, near aphoristic pronouncements and bedeviling dialogues between two or perhaps three voices in which you frequently aren't sure whether Wittgenstein is arguing for a position or against it. Frustration can ensure when contemplating the difference between someone in pain and someone pretending to be in pain. Wittgenstein declares that the sensation of pain is not a something, but not a nothing neither. The conclusion was only that a nothing would serve just as well as a something, about which nothing could be said. There is a cogent thought here, but the approach is opaque. This was even parodied by Jerry Fodor, and it could sound like this: I can't see a thing in this fog. And question, which thing? That's not very nice, but language is a quicksand, except it's not. Unlike the party trick of the deconstructionists who bloviate about difference and traces, there clearly are rules that shouldn't be broken and clearly ways of speaking that are blatantly incorrect, even if they change over time, and admit to flexible interpretation even on a daily basis. It's just that explicitly delineating those boundaries are extremely difficult, because language is not built up through organized hierarchical rules, but from top down through Byzantine overlapping practices. Some things can be pinned down with practical certainty, just not in isolation and without context. And we mentioned that before when we spoke about grammar, how we humans, the last couple of centuries, constructed grammars for language. And this is an obvious case of this solidification process. We look at language as it was something apart from ourselves. A little bit like forehand, we take language out of the world and we isolate it, we put it under the microscope, and we say that we can sort of delineate language, give it boundaries from above or from the outside of language, while not participating in language, but rather being outside of it. And this is, of course, the transcendence of the head. This is actually very, very clearly parallel to Descartes not knowing whether he exists or not, or how he could be sure that his thoughts were actually his thoughts, and so on and so on. Here we're not really sure if the language we speak and think in and use is really our language, but we start thinking it could actually be someone else's language. A language that we can take apart, dissect. We can remove one part and we can say that's a particle and that's a proposition, that's a verb. And by doing so, we think we find something out. But in reality, the only thing we find out by doing so is that we can't find anything out that way. Can't learn anything new that way. It's a parasitic thing to do. We are destroying the foundations we are standing on when we do those things. Well, in some cases it could be, actually, when it comes to language, reasonably okay to do. Maybe to explain some trait in some foreign language. But otherwise, as a common ground for understanding language, no. And especially no when it's in the beginning of language learning. We know now that that could actually be killing off the language instinct as such. It blocks our possibilities to get into the life world, because we get an idea in front of our eyes. So when we are in the life world, for instance, if I go to Normandy to learn French, this blockage will be in front of my eyes. And instead of trying to understand the Normans' life situation, interact with them, react with them, let my body be in harmony with those bodies of the Normans, and so that I can learn. Instead, the blockage makes it impossible to grasp everything. Well, not everything will be blocked out, thank God, but a lot. This is not conducive to learning things. This is actually counterproductive. We need to put our thinking process into areas where we actually can do some good. Where active thinking, maybe much more like a living language. We were talking about asymmetrical thinking the other day, which is much more akin to the living language, always on the move. And here's a fun thing. Google, there's a translator service on the internet nowadays. They come up with this idea, not trying to understand what was said. Instead, they counted how popular a word was, how often these words concurred with others. And they figured out which people were using which words. Anything as long as it didn't require determining where or how one should use a word. In very limited circumscribed situations like asking questions of certain specified forms, computers can actually figure out what you mean. And even then things are very limited. Google can answer how many ounces in a pound, but still can't tell me how many years has Obama been in office. Picking up an Obama and years in the office, Google returns some data about the 2012 re-election. But that is as far as it gets when it comes to understanding. And this is very smart, but to be able to translate every sentence of one language to another language, you need to have the complete life world. And that also includes what you want to do. So the semantic value of the words are not separable for how you translate them. Is that clear? You have something the words say. Jag vill cykla. We can divide that into semantical value and a word value. And the semantical value is actually part of the life world. And it could happen the same. Intention doesn't exist in the other language. The same life world doesn't exist. And this is exactly what Ashish Dalela said in Gödel's Mistake. We cannot rid the whole thing of intention. Intention seems to be a synergetic effect of the whole life world. And it is not necessarily so that it is the same. I guess it would be the same in all European languages, pretty much. But when you get further away, and especially if you take much more complicated sentences, problem will occur. We cannot avoid bringing in the whole life world in the translation. And a good translator does that. A good translator wouldn't say that Japanese farmer received a dollar häst in gift when translating some of the Ingmar Bergman plays into Japanese, or something similar. We need to know what's normal to do in the other language, and it goes for a lot more complication. And this is also something that's happening today. We take words out of their context, we put them under the forehand loop, look at them instinctively and distinctly, and all of a sudden we are standing in front of a mystery. And one of those things that occurred very much the last couple of years is the idea of abusive language. Racist, slur and similar. And that's the idea that you can separate some words and without context you can say those words are actually bad somehow. And this is similar. You say that those words refer to something in another world and that thing is inherently bad. So take that away and the thing in the life world would disappear as well. And that is completely lacking of all understanding of intention. I don't even know where to begin to criticize such a thing. It's beyond criticism in many ways. But you can turn the table and you can have a bad intention with the nicest words in the library. You can use poetry and be bad. Wordsworth did that. There are a lot of phrasings that are really, really offensive, but they don't use a single bad word, not a single reference to anything in a separable world where the bad things or the good things occur. It's in the action. And when you take away one half of the world, you are not stranded with 50% of the world. You are very much more close to 10% or 5% of that world, because every word is dependent on the whole life world. And cutting it into half won't give you half, it will give you much less yield, much less understanding. So I would say these people who try to correct language, i.e. they're really trying to correct the world, not language. They are badly mistaken on how important intention is in language. And the sheer idea to think that Google Translator ever can be another thing than a very helpful tool, but not a gate to understand a different life world. Google won't tell me how it's to wake up 7 o'clock and go to a French cafe, having a baguette with a café au lait, speaking to other people, reacting, having a temperament, not thinking much about time. It's all different life world. Not even the plans are the same in different places. All the pace is different, time is different, space is different. Without understanding that, we block out a significant part of reality. And it is the same blocking out of the body, just cast in a completely other form. And of course with different results. But in a way it's so similar. You go up in the head when you leave the body, and you're speaking of something meta somewhere else. You have left the situation. And by then you also left your ability to say anything about the world that makes any sense in any way. You become numbed. You become unable to speak effectively. And you have to understand that you will no longer have an effect in the world, that one can say. The energy is lost, the intention is lost. So don't worry too much about these tendencies. They cannot really affect language. They can affect a little part, and a little part that doesn't matter. So lack of knowledge means lack of influence. And if you think it is influence to do those things like correcting language, you are also mistaken, because that's impossible. Language is much, much bigger than ourselves. And it's completely solid. You can compare it to a chaotic system. A chaotic system doesn't get destroyed by throwing rocks into a water whirlpool. It gets stronger. And also these tendencies are actually a usage of language. Even if it's confused, it's a usage. And every time language is used, it gets somehow stronger. So don't mistake confused tryouts as really working, because this is not, this could be affected but not by that way. You need to have an effect in the life world. You need action and word. You need both things at the same time. You need the body and you need the word. That's absolutely necessary. And I think that's very hopeful, because it shows us everything is progressing as it should. No need to worry. The whole idea that everything is going haywire with the world, with the language, it is impossible. Not even the creation of Esperanto could make the foundations of reality to shackle. I have a recommendation here for our biography interested co-worker, and that is an excellent biography of Wittgenstein called The Duty of Genius. Go and read that one and enjoy it. And thank you very much, and I wish you a pleasant good night.